For those who aren't familiar with it, they might be confused and even ask, hasn't Syria been at war for a long time? Why is it suddenly getting so much attention? Especially this time, the government forces have made incredible progress at an astonishing speed. To give you some context, back in 2011, the government managed to fend off the shock of the Arab Spring. In the years that followed, especially from 2011 to 2020, with the help of foreign aid, the government launched counterattacks and regained most of the lost territory. But who would have thought that this time, it only took 12 days? Before diving into the current situation in Syria, we can't avoid an important topic: the religious issue. In fact, many conflicts in the Middle East are closely tied to religious tensions. Islam has two main sects, Sunni and Shia. Sunni is the largest and most influential sect, with representative countries including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Turkey. In contrast, Shia is the minority sect, with representative countries like Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, Azerbaijan, Lebanon, and Syria. The conflict between Sunnis and Shias has been going on for over 1,000 years, and their differences are almost impossible to reconcile. That's why this current situation is being referred to as the Great Reconciliation of the Century. In Syria, 85% of the population is Muslim, while 14% are Christian. Of the Muslim population, 80% are Sunni and 20% are Shia. This means that Sunni Muslims make up about 68% of Syria's total population. Among the Shia, the dominant group is the Alawites, who make up about 20%, or roughly 12.75% of Syria's total population. The Assad family has ruled Syria for over half a century, and they represent the Alawite sect. In fact, Syria has long been governed by a minority over a majority. This structure can be traced back to the French colonial period. In 1970, Hafez al-Assad staged a coup and established a new government. He was a typical strongman leader. In the context of global turmoil at the time, his rule did bring stability and development to Syria. However, his authoritarian methods made many Syrians view him as a dictator. Combined with the deep-seated tensions between Sunnis and Shias, local unrest was frequent. Whenever this happened, Assad would send in the military for harsh suppression. During the Cold War, Assad chose to rely on Soviet support. Syria's Tartus port was leased to the Soviet Union, serving as a naval base. After the Soviet Union collapsed, Assad continued leasing the port to Russia, further solidifying the relationship between the Assad family and Russia. In 2000, when Bashar al-Assad, the son of Hafez, took over Syria, he initiated liberal reforms. He managed to increase Syria's GDP from $18.9 billion in 2000 to $67.5 billion in 2011, more than tripling it. However, the wealth gap became too wide, tensions between Shia and Sunni grew stronger, and the conflict between democracy and authoritarianism became more apparent. These issues destabilized Bashar's regime. Now, we can simplify the situation in Syria by dividing it into internal and external forces. Syria's internal forces are numerous and complicated, with over 1,000 anti-government armed groups. Here I'll list just 4 of the main forces. First, there's the Syrian government army. Before consolidating its power, Assad's regime mainly controlled the major cities in central and southern Syria, such as Damascus and Homs. Next, we have the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, led by Kurdish militias. This group controls most of the eastern and northeastern parts of Syria. The Kurdish issue, in fact, is a legacy left behind after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Due to the long-standing Kurdish problem in Syria, the Kurds have always hoped to establish an independent state in their traditional homeland. Of course, the Syrian government disagrees with this. As a result, there has been ongoing tension and opposition between the Kurdish forces and the Syrian government. Next, the third force, the Syrian National Army, SNA, an anti-government group supported by Turkey. They control parts of northern and northwestern Syria. The Kurdish militias and Turkey are longtime enemies, so Turkey backs the SNA in their fight against the Kurds. However, the SNA also aims to seize power in Syria, putting them at odds with the government forces as well. The fourth force is the main player in this current operation, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. HTS primarily controlled northwest Syria, near the areas held by the SNA. Interestingly, HTS is labeled as a terrorist organization by many countries and remains on the blacklist of many nations. However, due to Turkey's own interests, Turkey allows the SNA to ally with HTS to fight the government forces. In return, HTS turns a blind eye to the SNA establishing outposts in Syria's Idlib province, which is under HTS control. So these three sides have formed a kind of interest-based alliance. Aside from these 4 forces, there's also the Golan Heights buffer zone, occupied by Israel, which became a hotspot for militant activity after the government forces withdrew. In addition, there are other anti-government groups and extremist organizations in Syria, such as ISIS, which are scattered across the country. Their relationships are constantly shifting, changing with the situation and their conflicting interests. The situation in Syria is complex, mainly because of its unique geographical location. It's not only a key passage for European countries to reach Jerusalem, but also a hub connecting the Arabian Peninsula with the Eurasian continent, as well as an important gateway to Egypt. These factors have made Syria a focal point of great power competition for a long time. Syria's Palmyra was once a major trading city on the ancient Silk Road, making this region historically a crossroads. It can be said that it's a meeting point for various civilizations, but it also means that whenever surrounding powers expanded, Syria often became the first to bear the brunt of the impact. Although Syria has a rich history, much of it has been passive. Even when strong figures emerged, they struggled to maintain control over the situation for long, usually shifting their focus to surrounding areas. Moreover, Syria itself has never produced a leader who could establish stable rule, which has contributed to the country's ongoing lack of a stable governing foundation. Syria's geographical location is highly strategic, with Damascus being just about 200 kilometers from Jerusalem. Even after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Syria remained a focal point of competing powers. The British and French continued to intervene until 1946, when Syria finally gained independence after their withdrawal. However, post-independence, Syria struggled to achieve stable governance due to long-standing religious and political conflicts. The Assad family has ruled for decades, but their Alawite identity has always posed a challenge to their rule. Since countries like Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states are predominantly Sunni, and have had long-standing tensions with Syria's Alawite-dominated government, plus the influence of Shia ties with the US, the Assad regime has faced hostility from the Sunni-majority Gulf nations. On the flip side, Syria has maintained close ties with Shia-majority countries such as Iran and Lebanon. Syria supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has been in a prolonged conflict with Israel. Additionally, Syria has connections with Yemen's Houthi rebels and Iraqi Shia militias, all part of the Iran-led axis of resistance, sharing common beliefs and objectives against the US and Israel. This backdrop has kept Syria's relationship with Israel tense. During the Third Arab-Israeli War in 1967, Israel occupied the Golan Heights along Syria's border, establishing settlements and buffer zones. Since then, territorial disputes between Syria and Israel have continued to this day. The United States has maintained a highly hostile attitude towards Syria, especially after the rise of the Assad regime. On September 12, 2001, just one day after the terrorist attacks on the US embassy in Syria was targeted in a terrorist attack. Although Bashar quickly deployed security forces to handle the incident, resulting in the deaths of the terrorists at the cost of 1 Syrian life and 11 injuries, the US nonetheless included Syria, along with Iran, Iraq, Libya, Cuba, North Korea, and Sudan in its Axis of Evil list. This marked a complete deterioration in US-Syria relations. For years, Gulf countries and the US have supported various opposition groups and anti-government militias within Syria. Meanwhile, Israel directly occupies the Golan Heights, using it as a strategic stronghold threatening Damascus. Additionally, Turkey plays a significant role in the Syrian conflict. As a Sunni-majority country, Turkey has profound religious differences with the Assad regime. The Erdogan government has long opposed the Assad family's rule and, under the guise of fighting Kurdish militants within Syria, has actively intervened in Syrian affairs. Turkey has had a long-standing conflict with the Kurdistan Workers' Party (PKK), viewing them as bitter enemies and officially labeling the PKK as a terrorist organization. Similarly, India regards Sikh separatists as terrorists. Turkey sees the Kurdish forces in Syria as an extension of the PKK and considers them a terrorist group. Like the US, Turkey has supported anti-government factions in Syria, while simultaneously targeting Kurdish forces, seeking to maintain its own interests and consistently causing trouble for the Assad regime. In 2011, Syria erupted in widespread anti-government protests and clashes. By then, internal tensions had been building for years, fueled by religious, economic, and class disparities, including significant wealth inequality. The involvement of external powers further complicated the situation, as various factions intertwined within Syria's borders, escalating the conflict. On March 15, 2011, large-scale anti-government protests broke out in Damascus. The unrest was initially sparked by the arrest of several students for graffiti, but as protests spread, the situation quickly escalated. The government deployed military and police forces to suppress the demonstrations, and the conflict between protesters and government forces gradually evolved into an armed confrontation. As the conflict continued to escalate, Bashar ordered the use of force to suppress the anti-government factions. This move directly intensified the opposition's armed resistance, plunging Syria into civil war, what is widely known as the Syrian crisis. There are various interpretations of Bashar's use of force. From the perspective of the Syrian opposition, Bashar followed in the footsteps of his father, the late Hafez al-Assad, adopting an authoritarian approach and using violence to suppress the people's demands. Bashar, on the other hand, stated in an interview that the use of force was a response to armed conflicts initiated by protesters. He argued that these so-called peaceful demonstrators quickly took up arms and were secretly supported by Western countries that had long been plotting to overthrow the Syrian government. From the Western perspective, they criticized Bashar's crackdown as a severe violation of human rights. In 2012, as the government forces began to pull back and concentrate their efforts on other regions, they withdrew from the Kurdish areas. As soon as the government troops left, the Kurdish Militia 1.0 took the opportunity to seize control of the area, successfully picking up the pieces, and rapidly grew into the Kurdish Militia 2.0, eventually becoming the third major force in the Syrian civil war, SNA. At the same time, the Syrian National Army, SNA, 1.0 was established in 2011. By this point, Bashar's regime was much weaker than his father Hafez al-Assad's, and he had failed to win enough support. Many Sunni officers and ordinary soldiers defected, joining the anti-government forces. These defected officers and soldiers, along with sectarian militias and ordinary civilian volunteers, formed the Free Syrian Army (FSA), with their headquarters located near the Turkish border, close to refugee camps. This geographical location made the connection between the FSA, SNA 1.0, and Turkey very strong. Turkish President Erdogan predicted that Bashar's regime might not survive the impact, so he began supporting the FSA. However, not only did Bashar's regime not collapse, but it also stabilized to some extent. While Turkey supported SNA 1.0, it failed to dismantle Kurdish militia 1.0, which instead led to Turkey accepting millions of refugees. That said, SNA 1.0 was not without fighting capabilities. They pursued a path of armed power struggle and, through multiple battles with government forces, managed to secure certain strategic positions, even tying down parts of the government army's operations. However, the SNA's ideology did not align completely with other anti-government factions in Syria, which led to significant disagreements and conflicts among them. During the Syrian civil war, the various anti-government forces eventually fell into internal divisions, turning on each other and engaging in infighting. In the midst of this chaos, extremist groups also began to emerge. In 2011, US President Obama announced the killing of Osama bin Laden, an event that became widely known. Following bin Laden's death, branches of al-Qaeda started to rise, including the fourth significant force in the Syrian civil war, the Nusra Front, HTS 1.0 version. The Nusra Front is a branch of al-Qaeda in Syria, and many countries, including the United States, have designated it as a terrorist organization. Taking advantage of the chaos caused by the Syrian crisis, the Nusra Front quickly grew in strength, becoming one of the major forces opposing the government. By the second half of 2012, it had become a leading force within the Syrian anti-government factions. Besides Nusra Front and the notorious Islamic State, ISIS, numerous other jihadist groups also took advantage of the situation to intervene. These extremist groups and terrorist organizations fought not only against the government forces but also clashed with other anti-government factions within Syria, with internal infighting and attacks among themselves. Nevertheless, ISIS rapidly rose to prominence during this period, expanding its influence and aligning with the opposition's victorious factions, becoming a major force to be reckoned with. At this point, the complex situation among various factions was far from over, as more external powers were about to intervene in different ways. For example, Japan provided support to the anti-government factions, excluding direct military intervention, while the US and NATO assisted in training the opposition forces. Turkey directly protected key members of the Syrian Free Army. Meanwhile, Russia became the primary supporter of the Syrian government forces, and Iran, along with Hezbollah from Lebanon, provided financial and material support to the government forces. At this point, although external powers had not yet directly intervened, the government forces were being pushed back by the anti-government factions, and their front lines were forced to retreat to the outskirts of Damascus. In the midst of intense fighting, a chemical weapons incident occurred. In August 2013, a sarin gas attack took place in a rebel-controlled area on the outskirts of Damascus, resulting in thousands of casualties. Both the government forces and the opposition blamed each other for being behind the attack. After the United Nations intervened and conducted an investigation, it was confirmed that rockets containing sarin gas had indeed been used in the attack. However, the investigation could not determine who was responsible for carrying out the attack. The incident sparked widespread international concern, with countries like the United States expressing intent to intervene militarily, while 15 other countries, including the United Kingdom and France, also voiced support for military action against Syria. The situation grew increasingly tense, almost resembling the scenario during the Afghan War. At that time, most people in the United States were opposed to direct military intervention in Syria, and there was significant opposition in Congress as well. Additionally, Syria's main ally, Russia, played a crucial role during this period. After intense domestic discussions and with Russia's mediation, the US ultimately decided not to send troops to Syria but instead demanded that Syria surrender its chemical weapons. Following this, a UN-authorized multinational team was tasked with transporting and destroying these chemical weapons. China also participated in escorting the mission. Although the chemical weapons issue was temporarily resolved, and Western countries did not directly intervene militarily in Syria, this did not mean they refrained from getting involved. While supporting the anti-government forces, Western countries did not foresee the unintended consequence that their support would indirectly facilitate the rise of ISIS. At its peak, ISIS controlled nearly 100,000 square kilometers of Syrian territory, with a population of over 10 million. Considering that Syria's total area is 185,000 square kilometers, and its population in 2014 was around 20 million, the scale of ISIS's territorial expansion is striking. As ISIS's power continued to expand, clashes became more frequent. In 2014, while seizing territory, ISIS had intense conflicts with the Kurdish militia 1.0, turning them into bitter enemies. This set the stage for the eventual cooperation between the US and the Kurdish forces. At the same time, the situation for the Syrian government forces was becoming increasingly dire. Despite receiving significant weapons and financial support from allies like Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah, the Syrian government forces faced severe challenges. By 2015, the government forces were still struggling with a lack of firepower, compounded by casualties and defections from prolonged fighting. This resulted in a dramatic reduction in their original strength of 300,000 troops, with nearly half of their forces lost. As a result, large areas of territory fell into opposition hands, and the government forces almost entirely retreated. By this point, the Syrian civil war had claimed over 200,000 lives, and millions had been displaced as refugees. Under the guidance of policies from countries like Turkey and Germany, these refugees flooded into Europe, triggering the European refugee crisis. Along with these refugees, members of ISIS also entered Europe. At that time, ISIS's primary target was France. In 2015, a series of terrorist attacks and chaotic events occurred within France, which not only shocked the French public but also caused deep concern in Japan, even prompting changes in Japan's policy regarding terrorism threats. Regarding the situation in Syria, if the Assad regime were to fall, Syria could become a breeding ground for terrorist organizations, raising concerns within the European Union. To prevent this, the EU and Russia began discussing military actions in Syria aimed at combating extremist groups and terrorists. Russia's strategy in Syria was quite different from that of the West. Russia advocated for simultaneously fighting ISIS and stabilizing the Assad regime by targeting opposition forces, while Western countries focused on combating ISIS while supporting Syria's democratic forces in an attempt to replace the Assad regime. Eventually, both sides reached some form of consensus on fighting terrorist organizations. However, in practice, Russia adopted an indiscriminate bombing strategy, targeting not only ISIS but also the SNA and the armed groups supported by the West, with even Syrian government forces becoming targets of Russian bombings. Assad accused Turkey of supporting ISIS, although the truth of this accusation remains unclear. However, it is true that Russian bombings heavily targeted SNA 1.0 positions supported by Turkey. Subsequently, a Russian warplane was shot down by Turkey near the Turkish-Syrian border, with Turkish President Erdogan stating, "Turkey has the right to down foreign aircraft that violate its airspace." In response, Russia accused Turkey of stabbing it in the back and escalated its bombing campaign against Turkey, leading to a sharp deterioration in Turkey-Russia relations, reaching a freezing point. The West questioned Russia for conducting airstrikes unilaterally, rather than coordinating actions together, arguing that Russia's actions had trapped them in a difficult situation. Russia countered, stating that if the West had not allowed people to infiltrate and plant bombs across the border, they would not be facing such consequences. Russia also pointed out that the West should reflect on its own actions. The Western countries were particularly aggressive in their fight against ISIS. The US intensified its airstrikes, partly as a form of revenge for the 9/11 attacks. France, on the other hand, escalated its attacks in retaliation for the terror incidents in recent years. The EU, grappling with its own terror threats, also supported anti-government forces in Syria, hoping to weaken the Assad regime. During this process, the US turned its attention to the Kurdish forces, known as Kurdish Militias 1.0. The Kurds not only had a long-standing enmity with ISIS but were also a powerful force in the region. Supporting the Kurdish forces gave the US an opportunity to establish a military presence in Syria, countering Russia, while also weakening Assad's government to limit the power of the Syrian army. As a result, with US support, the Kurdish forces were upgraded, marking the official emergence of Kurdish Militias 2.0. The first to break defense was Turkey. Turkey has been a sworn enemy of the Kurdish armed groups, and that's when the official rift between the US and Turkey began. While the diplomatic clash was happening off the battlefield, the fighting was also intense on the ground. Since the US supported the Kurdish groups, Turkey focused its efforts specifically on attacking them. With Turkey's financial and military support, the Syrian National Army, SNA, 1.0 version was upgraded in 2017, and the 2.0 version emerged. While others were busy fighting terrorist organizations and government forces, Turkey boldly deployed its troops in Syria's Idlib province. From there, Turkey, along with the SNA, attacked the Kurdish groups. As various forces got involved, the situation in Syria started to shift again. Other factions didn't just sit by either. HTS 1.0 realized that staying on the blacklist would eventually lead to the same fate as ISIS. So, in 2016, HTS 1.0 announced its split from Al-Qaeda and began consolidating other extremist groups in Syria, aiming to shed the terrorist organization label and move towards becoming a political party. Although HTS underwent an upgrade and integrated other groups, many countries still viewed it as a branch of Al-Qaeda, labeling it as a terrorist group. Meanwhile, as the US and Russia carried out heavy bombing campaigns and Turkey concentrated its forces against the Kurdish groups, the Syrian government forces, backed by their allies, launched a counterattack. The reshuffling of power among the factions on the battlefield continued until early 2019. By then, the US-backed Kurdish forces announced that they had taken control of the last ISIS stronghold, temporarily easing the situation in Syria. After Trump announced the US troop withdrawal from Syria, in 2019, Turkey seized the opportunity to send forces into northern Syria, aiming to target the US-backed Kurdish groups. However, this move triggered financial sanctions from the US, severely damaging Turkey's economy. Despite the US declaring its withdrawal, it hasn't fully left Syria, and the situation remains complicated. Syria's complexity isn't just about the battles between different factions. It also involves the US's resource exploitation and the shifting dynamics. In 2019, after the fall of ISIS, the group splintered into smaller terrorist cells that continued to operate in Syria. Meanwhile, the US's looting in Syria, particularly the theft of oil and wheat, was frequently exposed, which further deepened Syria's chaotic situation. With the help of allies like Russia and Iran, the Syrian government forces gradually regained lost territory and began to restore control. Although Syria's GDP has slightly recovered from a low of $21.36 billion in 2013 to $22.58 billion, economic recovery remains slow. Overall, from the end of 2019, the situation in Syria began to stabilize, with the government forces regaining the upper hand. However, this calm doesn't mean the situation for the Syrian government is looking up. The Kurdish issue in Syria remains unresolved. Kurdish forces, especially the US-backed Kurdish groups, continue to be a variable in the stability of the Syrian regime. The presence of this force has also triggered a strong reaction from Turkey, becoming the main reason behind its continued intervention in northern Syria. The Syrian National Army, SNA, which is supported by Turkey, is primarily tasked with combating Kurdish forces, especially the YPG. Turkey has also been dissatisfied with the Bashar al-Assad government. If the SNA successfully teams up with HTS to overthrow Assad's government, Turkey would not only gain votes and support but also strengthen its position in the Middle East, advancing its regional interests. Behind the cooperation between HTS and SNA, Turkey's support is seen as a crucial factor. HTS is heavily armed with advanced weapons. Many analysts believe this is due to Turkey's funding. In this complex game, the US has supported the Kurdish forces to counterbalance the Syrian government and its ally, Russia, while also working to eliminate scattered terrorist groups in Syria. US support is not just about containing Bashar's government but also tied to deeper strategic considerations. The existence of the Kurdish groups prevents the Syrian government from fully focusing on other fronts, especially in its confrontation with Hezbollah in Lebanon and the ongoing dispute over the Golan Heights. The conflicting support and opposition between the US and Turkey in Syria have led to continued clashes between the two sides. However, as the conflict continued, Syria's economy took a further hit. By 2021, Syria's GDP had plummeted to just $8.98 billion, with a per capita GDP of $421. This placed Syria near the bottom globally, ranking just above Afghanistan and Burundi, making it one of the poorest nations. The situation in Syria is especially complex when it comes to control over food and oil-producing regions. Kurdish forces have long controlled these key resource areas, leaving the government forces struggling with severe shortages, particularly in oil and food supplies. These resources have become the focal point of competition between various factions. The US has been accused of stealing food and stealing oil in Syria. While these accusations cannot be fully verified, the actual territorial control does suggest that the US military could be accessing resources through Kurdish-controlled areas. In this dire situation, the Bashar al-Assad government introduced the distribution of smart cards to provide subsidies to the population. While these subsidies are far from enough to restore Syria's normal economy, they at least ensure the basic needs of the people in government-controlled areas, providing a rare stabilizing factor for Syria. However, with the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022, Russia was forced to divert much of its attention to the Ukrainian battlefield. Some media even reported that Russia withdrew part of its military forces from Syria, handing over military bases to allies like Iran. This shift led to another major change in the situation in Syria. After reducing its military presence, the US deployed more forces to Syria, continuing its efforts to counter the Kurdish forces and other anti-government factions. Turkey, on the other hand, took advantage of the situation to intensify airstrikes in northern Syria, targeting mainly Kurdish forces and their allies. Amid this great power competition, the dynamics within Syria also underwent a dramatic reshuffling. The once dominant US and Russia powers gradually split, while countries and organizations like Iran, Russia, Turkey, Israel, and even Ukraine became involved in the Syrian conflict. Especially with Ukraine, despite being in a state of war, there are reports suggesting that funding behind HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly known as Nusra Front, may involve Ukraine, hinting at some indirect connection between the country and certain extremist factions in Syria. After the outbreak of the Israel-Palestine conflict in 2023, the situation in Syria shifted once again. The Syrian government's focus gradually shifted toward the Israeli front, which led to a reduction in domestic support for the government. This year, the situation in Syria and its surrounding regions has become even more complex. The confrontation between Iran and Israel has intensified, with Israeli strikes on Hezbollah leadership in Lebanon significantly impacting the Syrian government. Hezbollah has long been a key ally of Bashar al-Assad's government, and its losses have exacerbated the instability in Syria. Meanwhile, the Iran-backed Houthi rebels hold some influence in Yemen, but the ongoing rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran has kept Saudi Arabia as another critical opponent in the Syrian conflict. Additionally, militias in Iraq are looking for a foothold through guerrilla warfare against US forces, avoiding direct confrontation. As for Hamas, despite its relatively low-profile activities in Syria, it has not directly supported the Syrian government forces. In fact, the Syrian government's foreign support now primarily relies on Iran and Russia. However, with both Russia and Iran facing their own pressures, military support for Syria has become increasingly difficult. In his speech, Hamas specifically mentioned Turkey, signaling Iran's dissatisfaction with Turkey's role in Syria, particularly its support for Kurdish forces, which conflicts with the interests of the Syrian government. Ukraine's involvement has also added complexity to the situation in Syria. During the Russia-Ukraine war, Ukraine provided HTS with 150 drones and over 20 operators. This not only worsened the Syrian government's challenges but also deepened the ties between extremist factions in Syria and external powers. The most critical issue, however, remains Syria's economic crisis. The ongoing war has continually depleted the Syrian government's military manpower, which has shrunk from 300,000 to just around 100,000. By the end of 2023, Syria's economy was on the brink of collapse, with Bashar al-Assad's government struggling to meet both military and civilian needs. As a result, Assad was forced to take out foreign loans, and according to the 2024 budget, he plans to allocate $540 million to provide fuel, basic goods, and medical subsidies for the people. This amount accounts for nearly half of the Syrian government's total revenue for 2023. The Syrian government forces are facing a severe financial crunch. Their equipment is outdated, and there is a significant shortage of supplies. These internal and external challenges have left the government forces almost incapable of directly confronting opposition factions. Many Syrians, upon the downfall of Bashar al-Assad, celebrated with songs and dances. But the real question is, can the opposition bring peace to Syria? On December 8, the day Bashar left Syria, Turkey-backed SNA and the US-backed Kurdish forces clashed once again. During the fighting, the US took the opportunity to conduct airstrikes on over 70 ISIS targets inside Syria, claiming it was to prevent ISIS from regrouping in the chaos and to stop any factions in Syria from establishing ties with the group. While they framed it as counterterrorism, in reality, it was merely paving the way for Israel. The day after the US bombing, on the evening of December 9, Israel launched airstrikes on multiple cities in Syria, including Damascus, Homs, Latakia, and Qamishli. The targets included major Syrian air bases, dozens of helicopters and fighter jets, as well as the naval fleet under the control of the government forces. The next day, Israel proudly announced that it had launched over 352 airstrikes, hitting 320 strategic targets, and claimed to have destroyed more than 70% of Syria's military strength. Israel is particularly concerned that if HTS gains weapons, it could turn them against him. Israel is also stationed in the Golan Heights and has sent ground troops into the buffer zone to conduct military operations, which they call defensive in nature. The most shameless part was when Israel's permanent representative to the UN just stated that the actions in the Golan Heights are temporary measures, and immediately after, Netanyahu proudly declared that the Golan Heights would always be an inseparable part of Israel. He even plans to occupy Mount Hormon and its highest peak deep inside the buffer zone. It's truly unprecedented arrogance. The international community does not recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights, except for Trump. This is undoubtedly an act of occupation and annexation of another country's territory. Reports indicate that Israeli armored vehicles have advanced into the demilitarized zone, dangerously close to Damascus. However, Israel firmly denies this, claiming they are merely operating in the Golan Heights and fighting against terrorist organizations. But can Israel's fight against terrorist groups truly be considered an internal conflict? Israel's actions have sparked condemnation from many countries. However, instead of backing down, Israel has sent more armored vehicles into the Golan Heights. Right now, aside from Israel, Syria's major factions include HTS, which has taken over Damascus, the SNA, and the Kurdish forces. The SNA's main job is fighting the Kurdish forces, so they're clashing fiercely with both the Kurds and Arab factions in the north and east. At the same time, they're also engaging with some smaller anti-government groups. Turkey, under the guise of fighting terrorism, launched airstrikes on the 9th, effectively backing the SNA's operations. While the Kurds are battling the SNA, they're also facing off with some smaller factions. The fighting between these two sides hasn't ended yet, but HTS has managed to push Kurdish forces out of Deir ez-Zor in the east. The Guardian points out that Turkey's heavy airstrikes on the Kurdish forces might actually strengthen ISIS, similar to how the West's support for anti-government groups in the past ended up boosting ISIS. Honestly, in this chaos, Turkey's presence is far more noticeable than that of Russia and Iran. Apart from the US and Israel, the influence of other countries is relatively weak. During the US-Turkey talks on December 3, Blinken urged Turkey to exercise restraint, fearing that ISIS might take advantage of the chaos to make a comeback. However, if Erdogan insists on taking a tough stance against the US and stirs up a new round of political competition in Syria, the conflict between the SNA and the Kurdish forces could escalate into a new civil war. Even if the SNA and the Kurds temporarily halt fighting, it's still uncertain whether the SNA will continue its clashes with HTS. For now, they're just temporarily aligned for mutual benefits, but whether they can agree on future divisions of power is still unknown. At a meeting presided over by Bashar, the atmosphere was tense. His transitional government is struggling to maintain control, and even whether the government forces, which retreated to Latakia after disbanding, can keep their strength is in question. If they have preserved their power, whether they'll become local factions and emerge as a new opposition force is another uncertain factor. Additionally, a new wildcard faction has recently emerged in Syria, attacking indiscriminately, targeting anyone they can. HTS is also fighting some smaller factions, but they've been more neutral regarding Israel's actions. Many people are hoping Assad will pull off a reversal and make a comeback. Right now, it doesn't seem likely that the situation in Syria will improve in the near future. At the very least, Bashar can no longer lead the Alawite faction. On December 13, following HTS's call, locals took to the streets to celebrate the fall of Assad's regime. Western media broadcasted the event live, and it looked both festive and lively. However, behind this celebration, many countries are feeling uneasy. For instance, Iran's Khamenei has made a stern statement, while Trump and Israel are discussing how to contain Iran and strike its nuclear facilities. Meanwhile, Europe is urgently discussing how to handle the refugee crisis caused by the civil war, especially after tensions in Lebanon led to a large influx of Lebanese refugees into Syria. As the situation in Syria worsens, over 1 million new refugees have emerged. If these refugees head toward the EU again, it will be a huge challenge. If HTS ultimately takes control, Syria could very well become the second Afghanistan or Taliban regime, and Turkey and Israel would surely not stand by, possibly even intervening militarily. Moreover, Western countries like the US and France still consider ISIS a major threat, and the possibility of ISIS rising again amid the chaos is also significant. Right now, the situation in Syria is in complete turmoil. Some believe that the government forces still have some strength left, and Assad might make a comeback. Others speculate that Syria could become the next Iraq. But I think, up until now, Syria has not seen the emergence of an inclusive government that could stabilize the country. If this chaos continues, Syria may ultimately become a region rather than a country.